If you were able to join us in the last video lecture, you heard me introduce you to the idea that people have kind of come to the realization that this economic development, it really is beginning to empower some groups at the expense of other groups. And there's a lot of people that begin to look to the government, and I'll just use that concept very broadly right now, but they begin to look to the government to play the role of equalizer in American life. And what I want to do right now is talk a little bit about how some people, some groups are beginning to look to the government to provide that level of security. For right now, I want you to understand the idea of a white man's government. Okay? I actually do mean something that's quite racist when it comes to this concept. Historians refer to this period, the early Republican period, approximately 1800 to 1830, give or take, as a white man's government. Now, we don't mean anything really racist about it. What we really mean is that the United States is becoming more and more small d democratic for white men and less democratic for virtually everybody else. I'll go through this here momentarily and make sure that you understand this as specifically as you need to. But for the time being, understand that what we were discussing with Seth Luther and the idea of the aristocracy of capital, that had begun to gain some traction. And it had especially begun to gain some traction in the West. States like Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, once they become states, they're going to do exactly what Seth Luther wanted, which was enfranchise, give the vote to working class white men, irregardless of how much land they owned or how much money they had in the bank or whether or not they attended school at all. One vote for one man. So that's what I mean when I say it's getting more and more democratic for white men. But at the same time, guys, it's becoming less and less democratic for everybody else. You've got women who, as you will see, are going to be excluded based mostly on biology as well as custom, culture. You are going to see Native Americans who, partly based on race, will be excluded, and partly based on the idea, which is probably going to be a little bit abstract as it is right now, but based on the idea that they were a hindrance, they were an obstacle or a perceived obstacle at the time to empowering working class men. I'll come back to that notion in a minute, but the big one, the big glaring issue is going to be African Americans. They are beginning to see their position, even the free population is beginning to see their position in American life continue to degenerate, less and less freedom afforded to those people. So I want to start out with this idea of women lobbying for more and more equality, more freedom in American life. One of the women that recognized the need to enfranchise the ladies very early on was none other than Abigail Adams, one of the first ladies in American history. And one woman that is going to follow in her footsteps is the lady that you're looking at on the screen right there with me, if you're following along on the PowerPoint. That's Mary Wollstonecraft, who in 1792 is going to write this piece that's entitled A Vindication for the Rights of Women. And in this, Wollstonecraft is going to argue for the need for women to vote, that you can't really call yourself a democracy unless you're going to enfranchise, you're going to empower 51% of the population with the most basic of small d democratic rights. But for the most part, in the 18th and all the way through the 19th century, it's going to be 20 years deep into the 20th century, women are going to lack this public voice. It's not going to be until 1920 that men are going to enfranchise women in the democratic process. Now, part of how they're getting away with this at this particular moment is proclaiming that women already did, in fact, have the right to vote. They pointed to an idea that was coming to be known as Republican motherhood. What this meant was that, well, women don't exactly have power within American politics specifically defined. they do actually have a lot of power in the dynamic of the family. In other words, what women could do through Republican motherhood would be to lean on their sons and their husbands and their fathers and their uncles and their male cousins and their male friends and get them to vote for politicians and enact policies that were near and dear to the hearts of women. Similar to the British claim of virtual representation in the Revolutionary period, it was a play on words, and it was a shallow excuse to keep women from participating in public life. Speaking of women participating in public life, you are going to be beginning to see a pushback against the concept of women not really having a role to play in the American public. And again, one individual that I'd like you to be mindful of to that end is a person that we've seen and heard from in this class before. That would be Harriet Martineau. I introduced you the last time we met to Martineau. She was one of these working women of Lowell, Massachusetts, and she was the person that kind of raised the issue of how much power these manufacturers, their bosses, had, and what they were using that power for. They were using them to control both their life on the factory floor, but outside the factory altogether as well, saying that they could not attend dance class. Martineau is certainly not going to be alone in this idea. She is going to be very much a part of this movement that is really going to become aware of itself through the process of working in the factory. When Martineau and people like her begin to look around the factories and the dormitories at Lowell, Massachusetts, one of the things that they begin to realize is that they're all in this boat together, that they're being picked on, they're being bullied, if you will, primarily because they're workers. They need the job more than the job needs them. They're also being picked on, for lack of a better way of putting it, because they're women. There are certain social expectations and gender quote-unquote norms that are being enforced in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, and there's not really an equivalent in the male world. And so what I want you to understand about Harriet Martineau is, yes, she's a working class activist, and she's very concerned about, how much power these employers have. But she's also very concerned about workers as women, that women need to have some of their rights protected in the context of employment and industrialization. And so one thing that Harriet Martineau is going to represent is a growing feminist movement, a movement designed to empower women, both as workers and I'd also argue as citizens as well. And it's important that you understand that this movement is largely growing out of the factories, out of women's experience and experience is as workers. Another individual that is kind of driving at that point would be a lady that was a really important figure within this group calling themselves the Ladies Industrial Association, a woman by the name of Sarah Monroe. Now, what Monroe is going to do that gets her into some trouble is she's going to speak publicly on behalf of working class women like herself. And what she's going to say is, we ladies have rights for good jobs, we have rights to good jobs, and we have rights to fair wages. That you shouldn't be paying us these starvation wages when you know that we're worth more morally, you should not be doing that. And originally, it was nothing to do with what might be thought of as radical, backlash against workers and things of that variety. Initially, what gets her into hot water is the fact that she's a woman and she's addressing the public as such, which is something that you didn't necessarily do, even as late as the 1830s. If you were with us from the beginning, you know that there was this lady from Massachusetts by the name of Anne Hutchinson who got in trouble for something quite similar. She's conducting Bible study, but ultimately the problem is the same issue, and that is women speaking up in a public format. Sarah Martineau pushed back. And ultimately, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but what she said is, I'm coming before you, the public, in defense of our own rights. And I have the right to do that. As a citizen, of these United States, it certainly entitles me to speak up on my own behalf. And certainly I have an interest in things like jobs and fair wages and good working conditions inside the factory. And so my point in telling you about both Martineau and Sarah Monroe is that the labor market is really going to offer women a much more public role. No, you don't see them included the way that we might like to see them included in the bigger, broader political system, but it is creating a consciousness for women which will be instrumental in the growing feminist movement. And you'll see what I mean once we get to 1848 and the Seneca Falls Conference. More of that a little bit later in the semester, but for right now, I want to turn our attention to Native Americans. We've talked about Native Americans, and I told you about how and why the War of 1812 was such an important turning point for that group of Americans, that it really is a watershed moment in a bad way. From the aftermath of 1814 forward, you will see the U.S. government really dictating terms to Native Americans, and Native Americans having very little way to resist. They don't have any political power. Part of the reason for that is they have absolutely no voice in the political process. They don't have a vote, and they're not going to have a vote for the rest of the 19th century. Enter into our conversation a group that had really kind of accommodated the American expansion movement in the East, the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee had given up a good chunk of their land in the southeastern part of the United States. And then in the 1830s, they began to say, not one more foot, not one more foot of land. These is our ancestral homelands. We're not giving up anymore. The Cherokee are going to fight the federal government not on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. And as you're going to see a little bit later in the semester, they're going to win. Their case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will issue a decision that says because they're not citizens, because essentially what they are is a nation that has been colonized by another nation, they don't have to abide by your laws. They don't have to respect this thing that had come out of Congress in 1830 called the Indian Removal Act, which wanted to round up what was left of the Cherokee and shove them into corners of the North American continent that white settlers didn't really care about, didn't really want, predominantly Kansas and eventually Oklahoma, but again, more for another class. The Supreme Court's ruling was pretty much ignored by the President of the United States at the time, as well as the state of Georgia, of whom that Supreme Court decision was really directed. They just simply ignored it. They pretended as if it didn't happen whatsoever, and they began to dole out land to white settlers. So clearly this is a white man's government, but what's probably even worse in the context of a democratic failure would be the use of force to round up Native Americans, forcibly march them into these reservation sites, and take their land. Now, some of you that have a little bit of background in this particular topic and period will know that this is what we call the Trail of Tears. We believe that over 4,000 Cherokee people died along this process of being forcibly marched from their ancestral Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina to what was at the time saw as permanent Indian country, land west of the Mississippi, predominantly Kansas. But the Trail of Tears is another good example of a white man's government. You're seeing white men accumulate more and more rights, and a lot of times these are coming directly at the expense of people, groups like Native Americans. But the group that we need to talk about here would be slaves and slavery. On the one hand, slavery continued to be a standing contradiction to everything that the American Revolution represented. We have had, the process whereby leading Americans, people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, felt that slavery would eventually die out because it was an obsolete labor system. We know that African Americans served in the American Revolution. A lot of their service was rewarded with being emancipated. We've talked about groups like the Quakers who were beginning to see slavery as a sin in the Christian faith. Certainly, people from New Jersey, like John Woolman, a Quaker minister, believed it as such and began to push back against it. And it's clearly a contradiction to the Enlightenment, the idea that all men are created equal. Well, slavery begins to die out in the North. And we've talked about this before. We don't need to really go down that road again. It's not because people in New York are more moral than people in South Carolina. It just got everything to do with that New York's economy is not what South Carolina's economy is, and there's not the same need for that. But not only does it continue in the South, you're going to see this when we talk about the Cotton Revolution, it begins to be spread. It transitions away from being this, what Thomas Jefferson saw as a necessary evil, into what people like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina would call a positive good. And so that's the context in which we're dealing with when it comes to slavery and a white man's government. But in the middle of all of this, guys, we begin to see this religious movement that is really beginning to redefine American politics and American society in the 1820s and 30s. Now, what I'm talking about would be the Second Great Awakening. We've talked about the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and it was a series of these religious revivals that were erupting up and down what at the time were the English North American colonies. We know that the First Great Awakening was premised on the concept of pietism, which I had described as a more small d democratic form of religion. This Second Great Awakening, like the first, is a series of religious revivals. And similar to the first, you are going to see breakaway separatist churches that are beginning to emerge. You'll see the Baptists once again reemerge and form other denominations, other Baptist churches. You will begin to see groups that will break away from the Baptists during this period as well. You'll also see groups that begin to spin off from other more established dominant churches, groups like the Methodists, that'd be a good example. They're a product of this Second Great Awakening. Methodists had a really big taste for social reform. You see this in the North, and you also see this in the South. Evangelical Christianity, but for the improvement of human life, the improvement of humankind. Reform movements is what people of the Methodist variety really got behind. You'll see what I mean once we get to once we get to the abolition movement. A guy that you're looking at on the screen there is a Methodist minister in his own right, a guy from Boston by the name of Theodore Parker, who, as you'll see later on in the semester, is actually really going to push this envelope when it comes to forget about religiosity, but American law-abiding processes. Anyway, Parker was deeply, deeply critical of slavery. Parker was an early abolitionist, a person that believed that the United States should not be sitting idly by while people are bought and sold like cattle, while families are split apart, or while people are tied to a whipping post and have their flesh torn away from their bodies through the lash. He began to speak about this, began to preach about this from his pulpit on Sundays. Parker is going to become a very important, very prominent voice in not only the Second Great Awakening, but also the development of abolitionism. And that's what I really want to emphasize. I told you that groups like the Methodists began to grow a very, very recognizable social consciousness. And they begin to push back against institutions, including slavery, that they see as degenerative, contrary to the very concepts of American freedom and equality in their lifetimes. The Second Great Awakening, if you don't get anything else in your notes other than this, you do really begin to see an intersection between religion and politics. I don't really mean like they're pushing for more religiosity in American politics. What I mean is you do see deeply religious people, including Theodore Parker, immersing themselves in the political process. And a lot of this has to do with slavery. A couple other individuals that I'd like you to be mindful of. If you're following along in the PowerPoint with me, those are the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelica. They are abolitionists as well. They are also evangelicals coming out of this Second Great Awakening. And they're going to be doing a whole lot of, shall we say, essential work inside their churches. They're going to be the ones that are distributing newspapers, one that I'll talk about a little bit later in the semester, printed in Boston called The Liberator, raising money, doing these what at the time were known as mass conversions, converting people to their various sects and religions. But in any case, what they begin to do is they begin to speak publicly, similar to Theodore Parker. They begin to speak very publicly against slavery. And they were told to sit down and shut up in short order, and not by who you might think. I'm not talking about the slave-owning elite. I'm talking about people of the abolitionist variety, people like Parker, in the North. And it was because of that problem, the same problem that Harriet Martineau, Sarah Monroe had. Women were not supposed to be heard from. Seeing, yeah, we'll let you do the grunt work inside the churches. Some of these things that are making Methodism, baptism, for example, some of the most dominant religions in American life. But we draw the line when it comes to addressing a co-ed audience, an audience of men and women. This was seen as beyond the pale in the Grimke sisters and dozens of other women, like Sarah Monroe. They began to push back that this was their work, and similar to Anne Hutchinson, if God called upon them to do it, then it was their duty to do it. And so they're beginning to push back against this social and political norm that emphasized women had a separate role to play, and that role was not in the public realm. The Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, that is, has probably an even bigger impact in the Black community. What comes out of the Second Great Awakening of the African American variety would be what we would call the Protestant Black churches. Good example as to what I'm talking about would be the African Methodist Episcopal Church, what is today known as the AME Church. These individuals are beginning to establish independent congregations. You see the same thing happening in the Baptist community. These Black evangelical churches are going to play a really important role in African American life in the middle of the 19th century. And there's a very, very specific reason why. The Black church is really going to be the only institution in African American life, in American life, that Black men, and to a lesser extent Black women, have some control over their lives, and more importantly, have the ability to be able to evaluate their daily life. It was the only institution that allowed people of the African American variety to really cast their judgment on slavery, really explain how and why their lives were meaningful. And in the context of religiosity, this went a long, long way. Speaking of going a long, long way, the Black Protestant churches are going to play a very important role, both then as well as approximately 100 years into the future, when it comes to pushing back against political and social norms, what we would probably call institutionalized racism. I want you to think about this for a second. Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Richard Allen, who I'll talk about here in a minute, what they all have in common is they were all a part of this Black evangelical world that really grew up within the Protestant churches. So in the African American experience, these churches are an institution where people are coming together and they're talking about in the 1830s issues like slavery. In the 1930s, issues like Jim Crow segregation. In the 1960s, things like how we're going to implement a boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, to implement change. And so, for the Black experience in American history, this is going to be the Black Protestant Church, that is, a very powerful institution, vehicle, if you will, for social, political, and even economic change. But back to our narrative. I want to talk to you a little bit about Richard Allen. Richard Allen was a minister, former slave in the AME Church. And the person that he's really going to take issue with is a very powerful individual that we've talked about on numerous occasions in this class. A guy from Kentucky, Speaker of the House of Representatives from Kentucky, a guy by the name of Henry Clay. Even though he's from Kentucky, and even though he was a slave owner in his own right, Clay did not really think that slavery was doing the American economy a whole lot of favors. The reason that he felt that way was he felt that it was actually kind of keeping the American economy in the dark ages. We needed to take a play out of the British or the French playbook when it comes to their economic evolution. To that extent, Clay was not shy about saying we should abolish slavery. He wanted to abolish it. But when asked what ought to happen to all of these newly freed African American slaves, Clay kind of went back to the racist rhetoric. He said, I have started this organization that I call the American Colonization Society. And what it's designed to do is to transport all of these freed slaves from North America, in his words, back to Africa. Now, I'm using air quotes. Reason being is that that is exactly the issue that Richard Allen took issue with. He said, we're not African. We're African American. It'd be the equivalent of taking you or taking somebody of the German extraction back to Germany, dropping you off in Berlin and saying, get along nicely with everyone. You don't speak the language, you don't know the culture, you're probably not going to fit in politically because you're not German, you're American. And we're American. And we bled, and we sweated, and we shed tears, we shed blood for this nation. And therefore we wholly reject the very concept of the American Colonization Society. And similar to the Grimke sisters, similar to Theodore Parker, that was something pretty dramatic to do. Certainly from the perspective of a black man, that was something that you didn't exactly see every day. Not only pushback, but a very, very forceful pushback, and naming names. So as you can see, guys, the African American evangelical church, through this process of the Second Great Awakening, is going to become a social force, and it will continue to be well through the 20th century. Those of you that go on to take modern American history will have exactly an idea what I'm talking about. But for right now, I want to kind of put an exclamation point on all of this by explaining to you what's going on in Missouri. In 1819, Missouri was not a state, it was a territory. But it was approaching that 60,000 citizenship threshold whereby it could apply for citizenship. In 1820, it had passed the 60,000 person mark, and it had put in a petition to become a state. And in particular, it wants to become a slave state. Back in Washington, a senator from New York, not a senator, a congressman, a guy by the name of James Talmadge, said, Missouri, the only way that we are going to accept you is if you outlaw slavery, you make it illegal within your borders. The House of Representatives might not have been dominated by Northerners, but Northerners certainly had more of a presence than the South did, simply because in the House of Representatives, as you should know by now, your representation is based on your population. Big state like New York, lots of representatives. Smaller state, in terms of population, like South Carolina, handful of congressmen. The equalizer is going to come in the Senate, because at this particular moment, there are an exactly equal number of free and slave states. 2 senators per state, no matter what. Now, what that means is on its very best day, they're only going to be able to muster probably about a 50% chance of this passing. But even if that were the case, there were northern senators that had favors done for them, and they owed people of the southern variety, and they might be inclined to vote no on this. There were northern senators that had very connected interest to expanding slavery, and they clearly voted no on this measure. But the bottom line is this legislation introduced by Talmadge is defeated. And what the South generally says is if you want to play hardball, we can play hardball too. Maine had broken away from Massachusetts. Once upon a time, it was part of Massachusetts. And in 1820, it was applying for statehood as well. And what this pro-slavery contingent in Congress said is, if you're going to block Missouri, we're going to block Maine, right? More importantly, people really begin to talk kind of openly about the idea of seceding from the country and starting their own new country. Fortunately, Henry Clay is there to save the day, at least for the moment. What you're going to really probably remember Henry Clay for in this class is preserving the Union, preserving the country at very critical moments within our history. What Clay is going to do is he's going to say, listen, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a mathematician to get this. One state wants to be free. One state wants to be slave. Do the math. They cancel each other out. We'll bring Missouri in as a slave state, and Maine will cancel them out as a free state. Maine will have two presumptively free state senators, and Missouri presumably will have two pro-slavery senators. They'll cancel each other out, and you'll preserve the balance of power. But Clay was ultimately asked, that's great for right now, but what about next year? What about 5 years down the road when new territories are applying for statehood? Then what? What do we do then? Henry Clay devises what would come to be known as the Missouri Compromise. What the Missouri Compromise will emphasize is we're going to take the southern border of Missouri, the 36th, 30th parallel, southern border, and that will be the dividing point. Anything south of that border, Arkansas, Louisiana, will become a slave state. That's the only way that they will enter into the country, slave state. Anything to the north of that would become a free state. That would be the dividing point. And at the time, 1820, everybody said we can deal with that, we can handle that. So essentially it is crisis averted. Now there's one thing that I do want to bring to your attention. It's not funny at all. It's the continuation of slavery. Essentially what Henry Clay just did was he kicked the can down the road, or at least that's how I like to think of it. He kicked the can down the road when it comes to this issue of slavery. I guess you could have said we could have had this out once and for all and fought the Civil War in 1820 as opposed to 1860. We could have established that there would be no more slavery anywhere in the United States and had it settled. And what that would have done is it would have made sure that the African American community didn't suffer through the next 40 years, didn't have their families split apart, didn't suffer under the yoke of slavery. But at the same time, it's 1820, and people like Henry Clay were pretty convinced that if we had a civil war in 1820, we were not old enough of a nation, we were not strong enough of a nation to survive. And so what we needed was political compromise. The Missouri Compromise gave us exactly that. It bought us time. We don't have a civil war in 1820 or 30 or 40 or 50. It bought us enough time to the point where, I guess you could say, politically, socially, economically, politically, we were strong enough to be able to weather the storm that you would call the American Civil War. So it's a double-edged sword, and the crisis is averted, depending on how you want to, characterize and define that crisis, but ultimately we do preserve slavery for the next few decades. So this is going to be something that comes up again and again and again. And the concluding thought that I want to leave you with is this. Similar to 1784 with the Northwest Ordinance, What the Missouri Compromise is going to do is it's really going to drive at the idea that it's Congress, it's the federal government and the legislative branch of the federal government that will determine where slavery can go and cannot go. Congress in 1820 said slavery can go to Missouri. It cannot go to Maine. Slavery could go south of Missouri, Arkansas. It could not go to Iowa. It was Congress that was saying where slavery was legal and illegal. And that concept of Congress legislating the geographic boundaries of slavery would continue well into the immediate future. But in 1857, that conceptualization of Congress, that is going to be challenged directly. You'll see what I'm talking about once we get to a Supreme Court decision that's entitled Dred Scott. But for right now, that's where I wanted to get in this video lecture. And I will see you again soon.